In today's video, we're going to be talking about 10 cognitive distortions or faulty ways of thinking that might be contributing to your anxiety and depression. Hi everyone. In today's video, we're going to be talking about 10 really common cognitive distortions or biases in thinking that can really fuel negative emotional states like anxiety and depression. The thing about these cognitive biases is that often we're not even aware that we're doing them, and so they can work in the background and really fuel feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety, without us even being aware that they're happening. But before I get into that, just a couple of disclaimers to go over. I'm a registered psychologist in the province of British Columbia, Canada, and this video is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute or replacement for advice from your doctor or mental health professional. Now, with those things out of the way, let's start talking about cognitive distortions. So this video is actually a compilation video. A little while back, I did a series of videos on each of these cognitive distortions. And what I've had people tell me is they kind of like it when I put together these video series together in one video so they can watch the videos all in one place. So you may have seen some of these videos previously before, but this is a way of putting them all together so you can see all 10 of the common cognitive distortions in one place. So I hope that you find these cognitive distortions and the discussion of these cognitive distortions helpful. And so we'll start with the first one. Let's start talking about all or nothing thinking. So I want you to imagine a scenario that I'm at a job interview. It's a job that I'm really wanting and I'm really interested in. And things are going really well in the job interview. I'm answering all of the questions. I'm feeling confident. Things are going really smoothly. But then I get asked a question that catches me off guard, and I fumble it a bit, and I don't answer the question as well as I would have liked. And I end up leaving the interview feeling awful. I feel that it was a terrible interview. It was a complete waste of my time. It was a complete waste of their time. This is an example of all or nothing thinking, which is a tendency to view things as extreme, all or none. So I'm a success or I'm a total failure. My performance was exceptional or it was terrible. I'm either thin or I'm fat. I'm competent or I'm incompetent. I'm on a diet or I'm totally off the diet. Something is good or it's bad. Things are black or they're white. All or nothing thinking leads to this perception that anything that isn't 100% correct or 100% perfect is useless or equates to nothing, zero. And so you can see how this might negatively affect how I think about myself and my performance in situations, how I might think about relationships, recreational activities, work. You can see how this tendency to view things in this all or nothing way can really have a negative effect on how I perceive all areas of my life. But it can also apply to how I perceive other people. So the relationship is either perfect or it's horrible. My partner is totally considerate and loving or completely self-centered. That other person is friendly or nice or they're harsh and mean. So this all or nothing thinking, it dovetails and is really quite strongly related to perfectionism. So kind of like these perfectionistic expectations that we create for ourselves, but also for other people. Essentially, at its core, all or nothing thinking tells us that if something isn't perfect, it's pointless. It's worthless. If I'm not perfect, I'm worthless. If other people aren't perfect, then they're worthless to me. And so think about how this might affect my mood if I tend to view things in this way. So if I'm on a diet, what it means is that I must stick to that diet 100% of the time, or the diet's ruined and I have failed. What's the point of being on a diet or trying to improve my health if I'm just going to continue to fail at it? If I'm going to be in a relationship, my partner must be perfect in every way, or she's a monster and the relationship will never work out. You see this type of thinking a lot in borderline personality disorder with relation to relationships, where a person can either idealize their partner or see their partner as completely self-centered and selfish and awful. You can get this sort of fluctuating in terms of how a person with borderline personality disorder thinks about their partner. But it's not just in borderline personality disorder. We all do this, and this can come up a lot in a lot of interpersonal relationships. So this type of all or nothing thinking, what ends up happening is it leads to so much failure on my part, and it leads me to view others as failing me all the time. And so you can see how this might be a recipe for depression or anxiety. It just sets you up to feel disappointed in yourself and to feel disappointed in other people all the time. So if you engage in all or nothing thinking, what can you do about it? Well, the key with all or nothing thinking is to look for the shades of gray. Look for evidence that can balance out some of this extreme thinking. So any evidence that doesn't support this extreme way of viewing myself or the other person. Yeah, I was thrown by one interview question and I answered it poorly, but the rest of the interview seemed to go pretty well. If I stick to my diet 80% of the time, well, that's still better than not being on a diet at all, isn't it? Another thing you can do, another tip that you can do to try and address or get over this all or nothing thinking is to sometimes replace the word or with the word and. So that person might be a Republican and a nice person. You see, this type of thinking is really pervasive in depression, but unfortunately it's also becoming more pervasive in society more generally, particularly in politics, where we tend to define people and the entirety of who they are by their relationships to particular groups or political parties. So if, for example, I'm a Democrat and I meet a Republican, then they must be wrong about everything, and there's no validity to any of their opinions, and vice versa. And unfortunately, this has kind of become the political discourse in society. This has kind of become the way that we interact with other people who may hold different views than we do in various areas. So if they hold different views in this area, then I dismiss everything that other person might believe. So we need to get better at seeing the shades of gray in ourselves, the world, other people. looking for evidence or data that don't support our extreme views of a situation or a person. So if you notice or you want to overcome this tendency for all or nothing thinking, the key first step is to recognize and become more aware of when you're actually doing the all or nothing thinking. So to recognize the all or nothing thinking when it's happening, and when you catch it, to ask yourself, where are the shades of gray in this? What's an alternative way of thinking about this that isn't quite so extreme? Now, filtering is something we do all the time, every day. All the time, we're constantly bombarding with, we're constantly being bombarded with all kinds of information that's coming to us through our senses. We can't possibly pay attention to all of it. And so what we end up doing is we screen out a lot of that information and only pay attention to a little bit of the information that we're getting that seems important. So, for example, right now you're probably listening to my voice and watching this video. You're paying attention to the information that seems most relevant or important to you. Now, what you're probably not paying attention to is the light in the background, or the picture of the rainbow, or the feeling of your feet on the floor. But now that I've pointed out some of those things, you probably notice them more and are far more aware of them. They were always there. You just weren't paying attention to them because they didn't seem relevant. But now that I've pointed them out, there's some increased relevance, and so you actually notice them and recognize these things that a few moments ago you weren't paying any attention to. We're filtering information all the time. And this is a normal part of life. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's something we do all the time, which makes us a bit more efficient to allow us to focus on what's important. But in depression, what can happen is that with filtering, you start to pay attention only to the negative things in life. And you filter out any of the neutral or the positive things. So when you think about your relationship, all you think about is the disagreements and the arguments with your partner. When you think about your performance at work, all you think about is the missed deadlines and the mistakes that you've made. So what can end up happening is that as you filter out this positive and neutral information in your life, all you're left with is the negative stuff. And all you can focus on and think about are the negative things in your life. So what do you think that does to a person's mood? Well, this can result in depression getting worse. Understandably, it makes sense. It can also lead to poor self-esteem, unhealthy pessimism. These are all things that can result in even more negative filtering, and it drives a negative spiral of mood downward. Now, the thing about the negative filtering is it also relates to your mood itself. So when you think about your mood, if you're engaging in this negative filtering, when you think about your mood, all you can think about, all you can remember is the times that you felt down and depressed. As all of the times where you felt content or happy, they all get filtered out as well. So all you think about is negative stuff, and all you can think about is all the times you've experienced depression. So as you filter out these positives, it doesn't even matter that there are positives in your life because you're not even aware that those positives are there. So there are positives, but it's almost like it doesn't even matter if there were because I'm not even recognizing the positives exist. See, the thing is, we only respond emotionally to the things that we pay attention to. And if all I pay attention to are the negative things, the negative stuff, my life is going to feel like it's nothing but this pile of negativity. And I'm going to feel more depressed. And as a result, life becomes unrelentlessly bleak and depressing. So you can see how this filtering can just lead to this spiraling of low mood and leading to more filtering, and it just really drives your mood and how you feel downwards. So what can you do about this? What can you do about filtering? Well, the first step, like with all of these cognitive distortions I'm talking about, is you need to be aware that you're actually engaging in filtering. You need to recognize that you're doing it. And that, with depressed mood, it means that it's more likely than not that I'm filtering out a lot of the positives. So recognizing that the filtering and my low mood is causing me to not see a lot of things in my life that might be positive. The example I like to use with my clients to sort of demonstrate this is to imagine I was looking at the Mona Lisa. And as I'm looking at the Mona Lisa, all I'm doing is focusing on the nose. And I say to myself, well, how is this good art? How is this such wonderful art? It's just a nose. See, as long as I just focus on one small part of it, I lose a sense of the bigger picture, and I don't see it for what it is. I just see it for being a nose. That's similar to what happens with filtering. So when you catch yourself filtering, the idea is to imagine yourself zooming out. So you're not just staring at the Mona Lisa's nose, you zoom out and you pay attention to the whole picture. Think about using a wider lens and expanding your perception and your focus on what exactly you're focusing on. So it's not just one aspect of it, but a much wider picture to ensure that you're not just filtering out a whole bunch of stuff and paying attention to just a few of the negatives. At its core, a person, when they're disqualifying the positive, are rejecting positive things in your life and insist that they don't count for one reason or another. So disqualifying the positive is very similar to the cognitive distortion of filtering that I talked about in a previous video. Now, in disqualifying the positive, what happens is that negative events or negative characteristics of me or negative responses from other people tend to be assigned very high levels of meaning and validity. So the low grade that I got in that course means that I'm stupid. My partner telling me that she's upset with me means that I'm unlovable. Me not getting that promotion means that I'm destined to have a dead-end career, and that I'm not going to get anywhere in terms of my career, and I'm never going to be successful. Now, in disqualifying the positive, not only are those negatives assigned very high levels of meaning or very strong levels of meaning, but any positives tend to be dismissed or given very little significance at all. So even though you can recognize that there are potential positives occurring, those positives get dismissed or brushed aside. So this is what tends to differentiate disqualifying the positive from filtering. And in that disqualifying the positive, the person can recognize the positives, they just dismiss the positives. Whereas in filtering, the person may not even see that there are any positives. So these positives that tend to get brushed aside are usually associated with examples of assuming that other people are acting out of pity. So, yeah, she agreed to go on a date with me, but she just did it to be nice and didn't want to hurt my feelings. Achievements are assumed to be universal or insignificant. Going to college isn't that big of a deal. Everybody can do it. Good fortune or positive experiences are taken as examples of pure luck. Yeah, I got the job, but I lucked out because there probably weren't a lot of people who applied for it anyway. So I was probably the only choice. Now, if you've ever tried to talk to someone who was depressed and you tried to talk them out of their bad mood, you've probably seen this cognitive distortion at work. And it usually takes the form of what I call the yes but. So imagine you're trying to convince someone that they're not an idiot, and you point out that, hey, you just got like an A+ on that test. You've probably gotten an answer like, yeah, but I just got lucky because it was a really easy test. So there's the positives, but the positives get brushed aside. And this can be really, really sort of frustrating or challenging for family members of someone who is depressed, because they try to point out all of the things that are going well, but it just gets brushed aside or it gets dismissed. And that can be really frustrating and cause a lot of problems in interpersonal relationships. So the thing with disqualifying the positive is that the person recognizes there's a positive, but they dismiss it, they see no value in it, and they give it no credit. So what can you do about this? What can you do if you tend to engage in a lot of disqualifying the positive? Well, as is the case with all of the cognitive distortions that we're talking about in this series, the first step is to be aware of it and to be able to identify when you actually are disqualifying the positive. One of the things I find really helpful about understanding these cognitive distortions or these biased ways of thinking is that you get to put labels on these types of thoughts, so that it's almost like a bit of a mental shorthand that you can catch yourself while you're doing it and be able to recognize, yes, I am disqualifying the positive in this situation. But once you notice that you're disqualifying the positive, you have to remind yourself that positives count. That no excuses. Positives count, no excuses, no yes but. If negatives count, then positives must count at least equally as much. And you may need to find yourself having to continually remind yourself of that fact. Negatives count, so positives must count as well. So this can be challenging at first. I know it can be really, really kind of a tough thing to do, especially if you're used to disqualifying the positive a lot. But with practice, you'll catch yourself when you're yes-butting, and you'll be able to sort of intervene and stop it. So a question I often ask people is how well do you feel you are at knowing what someone else is thinking? I had a friend that I used to go hiking with a lot, and we would spend a lot of time on our hikes talking about people and other people and people that my friend was interested in. And there was this one time that he was talking about this woman that he was interested in and that he was falling in love with, and he he kept going through all sorts of examples of nonverbal behavior that she was engaging in that led him to think that she was really interested in him, or all the different ways that he was interpreting how she was responding to him as signs that she was really into him. So it'd be like something like she would be talking about another guy that she might be interested in, and he'd interpret it as, oh, well, yeah, she's not really interested in him. She's just floating out a trial balloon to see how I respond, to get a sense of whether or not I'm interested in her. I tried to point out to my friend, well, maybe she's just actually interested in this guy, but my friend, he wasn't buying any of it. This friend also tends to think that people are always sort of looking at him and checking him out and thinking that he's really attractive and they're really into him. Not surprisingly, you're probably guessing my friend is still single, and the woman was not actually interested in dating him. But this gives an example, maybe a bit of an extreme example, of mind reading, which is something that's extremely common. We do it all the time. But at its core, if you think about it, it represents almost like a telepathic power that we think we have. And in depression, what can tend to happen is mind reading takes the form of us knowing what someone else is thinking or feeling, and it's usually always negative. So I know what that person's thinking. They're thinking something badly of me. The problem with mind reading is that the interpretations that are made are usually possible, but these interpretations are given much greater weight and much greater likelihood than other more likely possibilities. So, for example, my friend, maybe the woman was floating out a trial balloon by talking about this other guy that she was interested in as a way of making him jealous, or the more likely possibility was that she was actually just more interested in the other guy. I mean, other examples of this is a friend passes me on the street and doesn't say hello to me. I assume that the friend's ignoring me because they don't like me anymore. I'm eating alone in a cafeteria, and I think everyone notices and thinks that I'm a loser because I'm eating alone or eating by myself. I get to work a little bit late, and I think about how all of my coworkers and everyone must have noticed and is upset with me for being late. Well, yeah, those are all possibilities, but what are more realistic likelihoods? Well, maybe my friend didn't even see me. Maybe the people in the cafeteria are more interested in finding a place to eat and not really noticing that I'm eating alone. It's unlikely that anyone at work would notice or even care that I'm a couple of minutes late to work. Those are much more likely possibilities, but the mind reading puts such great emphasis on the negative interpretations. And the thing with mind reading is that it can also lead us into thinking more negatively about other people. So thoughts like, well, he's just in that job for the money. Or she disagreed with me and thinks that my opinions are stupid. Or that person is a bigot. I can tell by the way that he glared at me. So I'm interpreting other people in a negative light based on how I think they're thinking. But, maybe that person is in that business because he enjoys it. It's not just about the money. Maybe she disagreed with me because she respects my opinion and wants to have a debate and wants to discuss it further. Maybe that person glared at me not because they're a bigot, but because I took the parking spot that they wanted. See, one of the big problems with mind reading is that it makes us feel much more certain than we should be about our negative predictions in ambiguous situations. So there's these vague situations, and I give myself a much greater sense of certainty as to what's going on based on how I'm interpreting what someone else is thinking. This can be a huge problem in close relationships, especially marriages. In these types of situations, the thing is, you get to know the other person so well that the danger is you stop checking to ask what they're actually thinking. And you tend to rely more on your mind-reading predictions of what they're thinking. So imagine that my wife is quiet one evening because she was criticized at work and she's still too upset to want to talk about it. But I engage in mind reading and I interpret that her silence means that she's angry with me, and I'm wondering, like, what did I do wrong? Like, I didn't do anything. Why is she so mad at me? And so what ends up happening is, I do this more and more in my relationship, is that I become less and less accurate in my guesses, while at the same time becoming increasingly more convinced that I know the other person feels, even though I'm totally convinced, even though it's completely inaccurate. And so you can sometimes see this come up in marriage therapy when spouses are stunned and shocked to hear their spouse describe what they've been feeling or thinking because they had no idea. They've just assumed they knew what their spouse was thinking or feeling based on mind reading. So if you notice yourself doing mind reading, what can you do about this? So if you engage in a lot of mind reading, what's the solution? Well, for me, and the advice that I tend to give my clients is the key to overcoming mind reading is to remember 5 words. Stay in your own head. Stay in your own head. When people first start to learn cognitive therapy skills, as I start to work with people and we start doing things like thought records, initially what they recognize is how challenging and difficult it can be to actually be aware of our own thinking patterns, right? We're not used to thinking about our thinking, and so when people first start doing cognitive therapy, they're surprised how difficult it is to actually tap into what it is that I'm thinking. So if it's hard enough for me to know what I'm thinking, even though they're my thoughts, even though they're in my own head and I have direct access to them, how much more impossible is it? How much more impossible would it be to know what someone else is thinking? This is the problem with mind reading. So when you recognize that you're engaging in mind reading, the key is to stop and to remind yourself to stay in your own head. If you want to know what the other person is thinking, ask them. Don't assume that you can interpret it based on, their behavior or what they're saying. You're probably engaging in mind reading, and if you're experiencing depression or anxiety, chances are that mind reading is incorrect. Let's start talking about the Fortune-Teller Error, which is similar to another cognitive distortion that I've talked about in a previous video, which is mind reading. And in mind reading, the person assumes that they know what someone else is thinking, whereas in the Fortune-Teller Error, the person assumes that they know what's going to happen in the future. So it's almost like the individual who's engaging in Fortune-Teller Error or mind reading has some sort of extrasensory perception. In the Fortune-Teller Error, it's almost like I feel like I'm able to predict the future. And in the context of experiencing depression or anxiety, typically the future is predicted to be dark and grim. And so I make negative predictions about what's going to happen, and then the fortune teller error leads me to assume that my prediction is right, that my prediction is accurate, and this is how it is actually going to turn out. Now, it's important to note that the prediction is often influenced by how I'm feeling at the time when I make the prediction. So what can often happen is when a person's experiencing depression, the worse I feel, the more depressed, the more anxious I am, there's a tendency to have more dire and more negative predictions of what's going to occur. So my predictions aren't necessarily based in fact, but it's more based in kind of how I feel. If I feel down, I predict that things are going to turn out negatively. If I feel anxious, I predict that things are going to go wrong or something bad is going to happen. Now, one of the big problems with the fortune teller error is that it can lead to almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So imagine a scenario where I'm single and I'm really discouraged about being single. I'm not having very much luck with online dating. So I might predict that I'm never going to fall or never going to find love. I'm never going to end up in a committed relationship, and that I'm going to be single and miserable for the rest of my life. Now think about how that might affect my behavior. Think about how that fortune telling may influence my behavior. What will it do for my motivation to engage in dating or put myself out there? What might it do for my willingness or my courage to ask someone out on a date? If I predict that nothing I do will be successful, which is kind of the point of the fortune telling error, then what's the point in trying? And so what ends up happening is I stop dating or I stop pursuing relationships, which in turn results in me not having a relationship. And the longer it goes that I'm not in a relationship, the more down and hopeless I get about ending up in a relationship. So the fortune teller error essentially becomes this self-perpetuating cycle where my negative predictions change my behavior in a way that makes it more likely that the negative predictions will actually come true. So it's kind of sneaky and nasty that way in terms of how those negative predictions drive behavior to make the negative predictions actually come true. Now, another problem with the fortune teller error is that it causes us to not recognize that our beliefs are actually predictions. But rather, what can happen if we do enough of this fortune telling is that we tend to see our beliefs as fact. So it's not that I perceive myself to believe that I'm going to fail a test, for example, but I believe that I'm going to fail the test. So why bother studying? So it's not that I recognize it as a perception that, maybe I'm going to fail the test. I believe I'm going to fail the test. So it becomes one of these things also of, why bother? It's not that I believe that I might not get a job. I believe that I'm not going to get a job. So why bother wasting my time with a job interview? So in this way, we behave towards the prediction as if the prediction was a fact. We behave towards a prediction like we have a crystal ball and that we're looking into the future and the crystal ball is telling us what's going to happen, and we behave accordingly. So you can imagine how this might negatively affect mood and depression. If I perceive that I'm going to fail at much of what I do, if I perceive and I believe that things are not going to work out for me, that the future is bleak and hopeless, what do you think that's going to do to my mood? Well, it's going to drive my mood down and it's going to make me feel more depressed. So the question becomes, if I'm engaging in this fortune teller error, what can I do about it? How do I change this? Well, the first step is to recognize when you actually are engaging in fortune teller and the fortune teller error. These cognitive distortions work really well when we're not aware that we're doing them. So the first step is to notice whenever you're predicting something bad is going to happen that hasn't actually happened yet. If you're doing that, you're likely engaging in a fortune teller error. And when you catch yourself engaging in the fortune teller error, you want to remind yourself that you do not own a crystal ball. And you're probably not very good at predicting the future, because not many people are. Now, another powerful tool to challenge a fortune-telling error is one that I've talked about a lot in other videos, and that's tolerating uncertainty. At its core, the concept of intolerance of uncertainty is really just an example of the fortune-teller error. And building tolerance for uncertainty through things like behavioral experiments or challenging your predictions by doing things to challenge those predictions, by taking risks, these are all powerful ways of short-circuiting the fortune-teller error, essentially testing out those predictions and demonstrating to yourself that in fact you aren't very good at predicting the future, just like everybody else. Now, I want you to imagine a scenario where I wake up one morning and I have a really terrible headache, and my head is pounding as I'm eating breakfast. And so as I'm there eating, I start to think about, oh my goodness, what if this is a brain tumor? And I start to think that maybe the cancerous tumor has spread throughout my body. I begin to think about how that might lead to my untimely death. I start to think about my final days lying in a hospital bed with friends and family coming to visit. And I see how sad people are and how they, go off to one side of the room and speak softly to one another in the corner of the room, sort of thinking that I can't hear them talk about what an awful shame it is that I'm going to die. And as I'm thinking about this, my stomach drops, my heart sinks, and I feel in total despair by the time I've finished my breakfast. And so I have a shower, and by the time I finish my shower, my headache's gone. As it turned out, I was just hungry. This is an example of catastrophizing. And what happens in catastrophizing is we take a relatively minor event and we blow it completely out of proportion. It's the mental equivalent of making a mountain out of a molehill. And so what happens with catastrophizing is that I take a relatively small event, like a headache one morning, and I imagine the extreme and horrible consequences that could happen as a result of that event. So a small argument with my friend means that the friendship is over and I'm going to lose all of our mutual friends because they're going to side with my other friend. If I get turned down for a date, this means I'm going to spend my entire life alone. If I make a mistake at work or I'm late to work, that means I'm going to be fired and I'll never find another job. If I have a brief dip in my mood, that means I'm going to spiral into the worst depression yet. So you see what's happening in all these examples is I'm taking something that could be happening, something that's actually tangible, and yet I'm blowing it up and it's mushrooming into something that is so much worse. So what happens with catastrophizing is twofold. First, I predict the worst possible outcome in the situation. And the second thing that happens is that I anticipate that if that situation were to actually occur, I wouldn't be able to cope with it and it would be a total disaster. So what ends up happening is that my emotional response, be it anxiety or depression, becomes based on the interpretation of that event rather than the event itself. In other words, I'm reacting emotionally as if my friendship is over and I've lost all of those mutual friends, rather than reacting to, I just had this small argument with my friend. I react to the scenario of being single and spending my entire life alone, rather than just responding to having been turned down for one date. I react to being fired and never getting another job, rather than responding to being late at work or making a mistake at work. I react to spiraling into the most severe depression I've ever had, then responding or reacting to the brief and temporary dip in my mood. So my emotional reactions aren't based on what's happening, they're based on this worst case scenario in my mind, this catastrophe that's occurred. So catastrophizing makes me feel awful, but there's an additional problem that comes with it. Because I'm focusing on an imaginary or imagined catastrophe, I'm unable to cope with the actual event or the real problem that's occurring. My emotional reactions to the perceived catastrophe interfere with my ability to cope, they interfere with my ability to problem solve, they interfere with my ability to take steps to prevent such a catastrophe. So essentially I become frozen by the distress and despair of this imagined catastrophe, and being frozen prevents me from actually taking steps to solve the immediate problem that I worry about becoming a catastrophe. So if you can relate to that, if you relate to catastrophizing, the question becomes, okay, well, what do I do then? How do I cope with catastrophizing? Well, the first step is, with all of these cognitive distortions, is that it's key and it's critical to recognize when you're engaging in catastrophizing. So this can be done by noticing when you're having a really strong emotional reaction to a particular situation. So you feel a really intense level of despair or sadness. You feel extremely anxious or panicky. And so then when you catch yourself experiencing those really strong reactions to a particular event, you want to ask yourself, is this emotional reaction appropriate given what's actually going on, as opposed to what I think this situation means? So the goal is to recognize that I'm engaging in catastrophizing, and then focus on dealing with the event, not what I think it symbolizes. And so what this does is it brings me back to what's actually going on in the moment, what's actually happening, the actual problem that's taking place. And that allows me to refocus my efforts on dealing with what's actually happening, as opposed to being frozen and incapable of dealing with a catastrophe that isn't happening, and a catastrophe that may never happen. Let's start talking about emotional reasoning, which is when a person uses the presence or the intensity of their emotions as evidence that the emotions are based in reality, or that there's some reality to the emotions. So people often perceive that they have intuition and that their emotions are telling them something, and that they should listen to those emotions. And generally speaking, that's okay, but when you're talking about anxiety and depression, this tendency can lead to a lot of problems. So things like, I feel so frightened, it must mean there's something really dangerous here. Or, I feel inadequate, so I must be worthless. I feel guilty, so I must have done something wrong. The problem is, our emotions are based on interpretations of events, not events themselves. And so if our interpretation is wrong, I'll experience an emotion that doesn't really match the situation, an emotion that is inappropriate or inconsistent with what's actually going on. So I can end up being extremely anxious in a situation that's perfectly safe. So imagine myself in a movie theater and I'm watching a horror movie and a really intense scene in the movie, a guy jumps out of a shower with a big knife and I react. My heart's racing, my hands are sweaty, I feel terrified. So I feel extremely anxious, but I'm in a big comfy chair in a big theater with lots of people. I've got popcorn in my lap. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's no danger. So the emotion is inconsistent with what's actually happening in the situation. Some other examples is I can feel completely hopeless at times when there's much to feel hopeful about. I can be extremely angry at somebody, even though they haven't done anything wrong. You tend to see this a lot in marriages. Jealousy provides a really good example for how emotional reasoning works. Now, most of us at some point have known someone, maybe even ourselves, who's been extremely jealous or suspicious that maybe their partner was cheating on them. And they have this feeling despite a lot of evidence to the contrary. But in a situation like that, because I feel the jealousy so intensely, I can interpret that something has to be going on, something has to be taking place, or I wouldn't be feeling this way. So then what happens is I start to behave in a jealous way towards my partner. Maybe I start to check her phone to see messages, or I ask her where she's going, or check in on her in the middle of the day. And what this can end up doing is pushing my partner away. They may become more withdrawn or disconnected because the jealousy is a big turnoff and it's pushing them away. But as they withdraw and become more disconnected, it makes me feel that something's wrong, and that just reinforces my jealousy. And so what ends up happening is the jealousy becomes this self-perpetuating cycle. And it's all based on this sense that I feel jealous, so there must be a reason for me to feel that way. Similar things can happen in anxiety. If I have ongoing worries about things that might happen, I might start to behave in ways to prevent those bad things from happening, which in turn just reinforces the perception that bad things are going to happen to me. It can also happen in depression, where I can have ongoing feelings of hopelessness, and if I feel hopeless, I can feel like a failure before I've even started working on a goal. And so if I'm going to fail at the goal, maybe I procrastinate, or maybe I don't even work towards the goal, because what's the point? I'm probably going to fail. And this can lead to even greater hopelessness because I feel that change isn't even possible, even if I were to try. So the interesting thing about emotional reasoning is that people who tend to use emotional reasoning only tend to do it with unpleasant emotions, with negative emotions. So I rarely ever see people that assume that when they feel happy, everything must be fine, right? They don't necessarily feel that way. It's just, well, I feel happy. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything's fine, everything's going to continue to be fine. So emotional reason can be this really kind of challenging pitfall that people can get into if they engage in emotional reasoning a lot. So the question becomes, how do you manage emotional reasoning? So the first thing is to recognize that you're actually doing it, that you're actually engaging in emotional reasoning. Label it and recognize it for what it is. I'm using my emotions as evidence of this feared outcome. And once you've identified that you're engaging in emotional reasoning, remind yourself that emotions lie. Just because you feel it doesn't mean that it's real. So don't believe everything that you feel. Look for evidence that might support your emotions. I'm not saying, kind of cover your ears, close your eyes, and just imagine everything's going to turn out well. But the idea is, look for evidence that may support your anxiety feelings or your depression feelings. But equally as important, look for any evidence that doesn't support how you feel. And in this way, what you're doing is you're allowing your emotions to be based on what's actually happening rather than your emotions to be based on the fact that you're having those emotions. And so to explain overgeneralization, I want you to imagine a scenario. Suppose I'm having a bad day and I'm driving home and I'm getting frustrated when I'm driving and I get stopped at a red light. Then I get really upset and really frustrated and I think to myself, I always get stuck at every red light. This is an example of overgeneralization in everyday life. What happens in overgeneralization is that we take a single event and use that single event to represent an invariable and unchanging rule. One negative event becomes a never-ending pattern. So if I make a mistake on one assignment, I'm bound to fail this course. One criticism from my partner is just the start of a series of complaints to follow. A rainy day means that the sun isn't going to come out for the rest of my vacation. If I interview for a job and don't get it, I'll never get a job. These are all examples of overgeneralization. And where overgeneralization comes from is that we all tend to look for patterns in our lives. We all like to see patterns because patterns help us predict what might happen next and to help allow us to plan for the future. But in overgeneralization, what happens is the perceived patterns all tend to be negative. And the danger is that you accept them to be true really before you have any evidence to support whether or not these patterns are true or not. So what can happen with overgeneralization is that you can tend to end up viewing negative experiences as a set pattern, that's just what's going to always happen. You can also assume that one failure is going to predict ongoing failure in the same activity, in the same task. So for example, if I'm unsuccessful asking a woman out for a date, I'm always going to be unsuccessful asking anyone out on a date. This can also lead to worsening negative self-talk and sort of really getting more critical and harsh with myself. And it can contribute to a feeling that I can't do anything right. So what overgeneralization does is it tends to lead to a person's life getting smaller and more restricted due to faulty beliefs about what they can't do, what they don't like doing, or what they have to avoid doing, or something bad will happen. So you can see how this type of cognitive distortion can lead to feelings of hopelessness, anxiety, and social situations, and excessive worry. And so that's why overgeneralization tends to be seen a lot in people who are experiencing depression, social anxiety, and generalized anxiety disorder. So if you catch yourself engaging in this overgeneralization, what can you do about it? How do you short circuit this? How do you stop engaging in overgeneralization? Well, the first is you need to recognize when you're engaging in overgeneralization and paying attention to those signs of overgeneralization beliefs. Now, the thing with overgeneralization that's useful is that there are usually some key words that indicate when you're engaging in overgeneralization. So some of these key words are things like always, never, all the time. when you catch yourself using these words, it's usually a red flag that you're engaging in overgeneralization. Do I always get stuck at every red light every single time? Do people never reach out to me to get together? Is my partner upset with me all the time? So you probably get a sense by the way I'm emphasizing those words. If you ask yourself those questions, you know what the answer is. You know that the answer isn't true. And so if you can find examples of any situations that show that these beliefs are not true all the time, what it does is it immediately changes the nature of the thought. And you get to a much more sort of realistic or balanced thought. Yes, my partner is upset with me now, but for much of the past week, we've gotten along pretty well. That's a much different type of thought than my partner is always upset with me. So the key point with overgeneralization, the key point to remember is there are absolutely no absolutes. So watch out for absolute types of thinking. And when you catch yourself overgeneralizing, ask yourself, is this true? And try to think of examples when things went well rather than just the negative outcomes. And so with overgeneralization, if you can just find one example that doesn't support the overgeneralized belief, then what it does is it means that that entire belief is untrue. So if there's ever been a time where I didn't get stopped at a red light, what it means is that the belief that I always get stopped at a red light is completely untrue. So keep an eye out for those key words to help identify and challenge overgeneralization. Now, labeling is a cognitive distortion that at its core makes a temporary event a permanent trait or characteristic of a person. So what happens is that rather than thinking about the behavior of another person, labeling is used to provide a global description of the whole person. So rather than just a singular event sort of being how I define a person, I use that event to define the entirety of that person. So, for example, if I fail a test, I'm a failure. I did not do the dishes, I didn't complete all the dishes, so I'm a slob. I made an error at work, so I'm an idiot. Now, the thing is, we can also apply labels to other people. Labeling isn't just about ourselves, it's labels that we apply to others as well. So the coworker who spoke to me curtly, that person's a jerk. My girlfriend who forgot her anniversary, she's self-centered. So what ends up happening when we engage labeling is that we attach the label to the person or ourselves, and then we tend to filter out any information that doesn't fit in with that label. And we tend to focus on any information that does apply to that label. So negative events and behaviors are given more importance or more relevance than positive ones. So when I fail at something at work, that failure is noted and converted into the trait of me being an idiot. So I remember all the times that I failed, and those are all examples of why I'm an idiot. But my repeated successes at work, at the same time, they're largely ignored. Now, what's interesting with labeling is that rarely do people label themselves when things go well. So I did well at that project at work, so I'm a winner. People don't typically do that. They don't tend to think of themselves that way. So we typically don't apply labels to ourselves that are really positive based on singular events. Now, labeling can cause inaccurate thinking, but it can also maintain and fuel painful emotions like depression or sadness. So if I fail a test and take that to mean that I'm an idiot and a total failure, how do you think that's going to make me feel? Well, I'm probably going to feel pretty sad. I'm probably going to have a sense of despair and a sense of hopelessness. And if I start to believe the label, then what tends to happen is that I start to feel that there's nothing I can do to really change it. So at its core, what labeling does is it takes a solvable problem and makes it something that can't be solved. So imagine a scenario where I just started at a new job and I discover that I've misfiled something and made a simple mistake. Well, what should I do about that? What could I do about that? Well, in a situation like that, the solution seems relatively simple. Go to whatever it was that I misfiled it and refile it in the proper way. If I just focus on what I did, if I just focus on my behavior, it gives me an opportunity to think about ways of correcting that behavior. However, imagine that I misfiled something at work and then I think to myself that I'm a complete idiot, I'm a complete moron. What should I do about being an idiot and a moron? Do you see the problem? How do I change the fact that I'm an idiot and a moron? See, by engaging in labeling, what's happening in this scenario and in others is that I turn a minor problem, like misfiling something at work, and now I've made it something that is concrete and unchangeable. I'm an idiot and I'm a moron. The same applies for when we label other people. If someone's behavior rubs us the wrong way and I attach a label to the person that person's a jerk, what that means is that they'll always be a jerk and that there's nothing they can do to not be a jerk. So it's this type of labeling, it can cause a lot of difficulties and problems in interpersonal relationships where people will hold grudges against others because of singular events that have occurred, because after those singular events, they attach a label to that other person that kind of fuels that grudge or that bad blood that they have. So if you notice yourself engaging in labeling, what can you do about it? How can you sort of correct or modify this way of thinking? Well, the first step is to recognize it and to label that you're engaging in labeling, right? So to be aware and to recognize earlier on in the process that I'm actually behaving in this way, I'm actually thinking in this way, that I'm labeling something. See, the thing is, cognitive distortions, they work really well when we're not aware that we're doing them, but when we are aware of them, it really can help short circuit that cycle. So when you notice that you're engaging in labeling, the idea is to put aside the label and focus on the behavior that you notice. So things like, I failed one test. The person was late to work. My wife left the bathroom light on. By focusing on these events, by focusing on the behavior and not the person, what you might find is that you have less intense negative emotions toward yourself or the other person. Additionally, problems that may have felt like they were unsolvable, or people in your life who seemed like they were extremely difficult or impossible to deal with, all of these things suddenly become more manageable when you just focus on the behavior as opposed to a label that becomes an unchangeable characteristic of yourself or the other person. Let's start talking about magnification and minimization. So this cognitive distortion has kind of the two components. The first is magnification. And in magnification, what tends to happen is you tend to exaggerate your mistakes or your setbacks, and you tend to magnify other people's achievements. So, for example, that person has so many followers on Twitter. They're so popular. Whereas for me, I took the wrong bus the other day. I'm such an idiot. Now, at the same time, the person also engages in minimization. And what happens with minimization is that we tend to minimize our own achievements and minimize other people's mistakes or setbacks. So something like, yeah, sure, I have a good job, but I'm totally unqualified for what I'm doing, and it's only a matter of time until they find out that I'm an imposter and they fire me. Whereas for someone else, I might think, yeah, sure, that person lost their job, but it was probably just unfortunate office politics that they got caught up in. So the result of magnification and minimization is that you always come out looking and feeling inferior to other people. But why does this happen? Now, one possibility is that we have distorted perceptions of what we're doing versus what other people are doing. I call this the Facebook or the Instagram effect, where we're all well aware of all of the problems and all of the things that are going wrong in our lives. But the only information I get from other people, or much of the only information I get from other people, is based on the highlight reel that they're posting on their social media. So they're posting all these things about successes and great places that they're going and awesome things that they're doing. And so it becomes really easy for me to assume that, wow, that person's life is going so well, they've got it all together. Whereas for me, I know about all of the problems, all of the things that are going wrong in my life, and it doesn't even feel like I can compare to them. So therefore, based on kind of this Facebook or Instagram effect, my life is full of problems and setbacks, whereas other people seem to be doing so much better in life than I am. Now, another way that magnification and minimization works is that we tend to develop different standards or different expectations for ourselves versus other people. And so what often happens is that there's a tendency to set really high standards for myself. So I'll set really high, often unrealistic standards for me, whereas I have reasonable standards for other people. So the result is that it seems like I'm going to have a whole lot more failures than others and far fewer successes. But this isn't because I'm more of a failure or that other people are more successful, but this is because I have different standards for myself, which makes it difficult for me to feel good about how I'm doing relative to the standards that I have for other people. So one way of thinking about it is to imagine a high jump contest. And in this high jump contest, one person sets the bar at 6 feet. And everybody else's bar is set at 3 feet. Now, although that first person may be able to jump higher than everybody else, they're likely going to have many fewer successes than other people because the standard is so much higher. So because their bar is so much higher, every once in a while they may clear it, but they're going to be knocking down that bar a lot. Whereas for people who are setting the bar at 3 feet, it's really easy to just keep getting over that bar and they don't have nearly as many failures. It's not because they're better jumpers or they're better high jumpers. It's just that their bar is set so much lower. So the more I fail to achieve these high standards for myself, the worse I feel about myself. And this can fuel depression. So if I recognize that I'm engaging in this magnification and minimization, well, what can I do about it? How do I fix it? Well, the first thing is to recognize when you're actually engaging in magnification and minimization. And then once you've identified that you're doing it, focus on having the same scale for everybody, yourself included. So one thing you can do is to imagine a scenario in which you feel disappointed with a score that you got on a test. And in that scenario, imagine someone else telling you that they received the exact same mark. Would you tell them that they had completely failed, that they were a total idiot? Well, if not, then you're likely using a higher and unrealistic standard for yourself than you are for other people. Now, somewhere along the lines, we developed this sense, this perception that being harsh or more critical of ourselves was a good thing because it would motivate us to push ourselves harder or try to achieve more. However, all it really does is the opposite. And I've discussed this a lot more in a video that I've talked about with regards to coaching style, and I'll leave a link to it up above if you want to take a look at that video. But it really does dovetail nicely with this notion of magnification and minimization. So the key is to figure out a scale of what you would see as good enough for other people, and to make sure that you're using that same scale for yourself. So that's it for the discussion on the 10 cognitive distortions, the 10 common cognitive distortions and biases in thinking that people will often engage in. I hope you found the information helpful. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas about these cognitive distortions or any questions you might have. So please leave me some comments in the comments section down below. If you've been enjoying my videos and would like to see more, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell, and you'll be alerted every week when I post a new video. So that's all for today's video. As always, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one.